power, principle, and political philosophy, the Kadaga among contests in the NRM Delegates Conference. Politics, with ruling parties, often unfolds not as a debate between ideals, but as a contestation of access to patronage, influence, and symbolic recognition. The recent election at the NRM Delegates Conference, which pitted Rebecca Alitwala Kadaga against Anita Anetamo, serves as a case study of the inner contradictions of Uganda's dominant party system, where loyalty to the president weighs more heavily than democratic ethics. Kadaga, a veteran of Ugandan politics and a historical pillar within the NRM, entered the contest with the confidence of one who had carried the party banner for decades, both in parliament and in the larger political landscape. She reminded the delegates and the nation of her long tenure, a founder within the Central Executive Committee, a relentless promoter of women's rights, and the first female Speaker of Parliament. Yet, despite her record, she found herself confronting a system increasingly designed not to reward institutional memory, but to ensure flexibility of loyalty to President Yoweri Museveni Kagota. Let me start by the Kadaga complaint, corruption, conflict of interest, and betrayal. Kadaga's central grievance rested on three interconnected charges. The first one is bribery of delegates. She accused her opponents of flooding the electorate with material inducements, cash, promises, and favors that corrupted the integrity of the process. Our lament was not merely tactical, but philosophical. Bribery here was not an incidental irregularity. It represented the erosion of the NRM's historical legitimacy, turning the party from a liberation movement into a marketplace of loyalty. Conflict of interest, that's the second thing. Kadaga highlighted that Dr. Tanga Odoi, the party's electoral commission chair, had a son contesting for office in another position of the election. In political philosophy, this would be framed as a collapse of the principle of impartiality. The arbiter of fairness became a participant in the stakes of the game, undermining the trust that is supposed to bind political communities. The third thing is undermining our legacy. Kadaga complained that our decades of service, our defense of women's rights, our visibility as speaker, and our loyalty to the NRM were ignored or discounted. She interpreted the choice of Anita Among not as the emergence of a fresh leader, but as a deliberate act of betrayal orchestrated to show that no individual is indispensable in a system controlled from the top. From Kadaga's standpoint, the election became not merely a political defeat, but a symbolic disposition. She was being written out of the party she helped to build. The second thing that I should talk about is among silence and the philosophy of strategic minimalism. In contrast, Anita Among spoke less. Her campaign strategy was marked not by extensive justification, but by minimal rhetoric. In political communication, silence can sometimes speak louder than words. By avoiding direct confrontation with Kadaga's charges, Among positioned herself as the candidate of acceptance rather than resistance, one who did not challenge the president's authority, one who did not seek to remind the party of old debts, and one who did not raise uncomfortable questions about internal corruption. Our silence was therefore not weakness, but strategic acquiescence. It was a tacit recognition that within the NRM, Power is less about moral vindication and more about demonstrating loyalty and manageability. Where Kadaga insisted on reminding the party of its debts to her, Among allowed herself to be perceived as a vessel of continuity without complication. The third thing I should talk about is women's rights and the paradox of representation. A deeper irony pervaded the contest. Kadaga, the long-time champion of women's rights, argued that her displacement undermined the struggle for gender empowerment within Ugandan politics. Yet our critics, like Among included, suggested the opposite, that Kadaga had monopolized representation, clinging to high office in the name of women, but never allowing space for new female leaders to emerge. This presents a philosophical paradox in feminist political theory. Can the advancement of women be reduced to the persistence of a single woman in high office? Or must true empowerment involve rotation, inclusivity, and generational transfer? Museveni himself has often deployed women's representation as a rhetorical shield against democratic criticism. By empowering individuals such as Kadaga, Janet Museveni, and others, the regime demonstrates progressive credentials while ensuring that such individuals remain ultimately dependent on presidential benevolence. Thus, Kadaga's achievements as speaker, though real, were embedded in a political economy where women's rise was conditional on loyalty to the patriarch of the state. Fourthly, the president's earned arbitration through duplication. No analysis of NRM internal election can proceed without acknowledging the central role of President Museveni. This contest was less about Kadaga versus Among than it was about Museveni versus the risk of entrenched autonomy. Mark that point, the risk of entrenched autonomy. Kadaga's insistence on her indispensability was itself a threat. The president has always feared addictive power, not in himself, but in his lieutenants. For Museveni, no one must become too irreplaceable. By appearing to support both Kadaga and Among simultaneously, he ensured a win-win. Whoever prevailed would still owe their victory to his shadow, funding, and blessings. If indeed Museveni quietly advised Kadaga to step down and she refused, then her defeat was a lesson in the limits of defiance within a patronage order. She merely experienced what countless lower-ranking cadres have faced before. The realization that merit, history, and loyalty matter less than the president's current calculus of control. Like UPC sign, bribery, conflict of interest, and political mobilization is the fifth I'm talking about. Kadaga's outrage at bribery and conflicts of interest, while valid, was also ironic. These practices have long been normalized within the NRM. Delegates expect facilitation at every election. Positions are distributed not through transparent competition, but through calculated patronage. For Kadaga to suddenly emphasize these issues is to highlight how principles often become urgent only when one is personally disadvantaged by their violation. In political philosophy, this is the problem of selective indignation. What is tolerated as business as usual when it benefits us becomes injustice when it harms us. Kadaga thus confronted not a new reality, but the very machinery she had once helped legitimize. The sixth thing is the philosophical core, party, person, and power. At its heart, this election underscores three enduring truths about the NRM and, by extension, many dominant party systems. The party is an extension of the leader. Let me explain. The NRM does not operate as an autonomous institution, but as an appendage of Museveni's presidency. Internal democracy is less about collective choice and more about reflecting the balance of loyalty that best serves the leader. The person is disposable. Let me explain this. Even the most decorated cadres like Kadaga are ultimately disposable when their persistence threatens to ossify into autonomy. The system thrives on the circulation of elites precisely to prevent the consolidation of any one alternative center of loyalty. Power is patronage. And not principle. Let me explain the third one. Elections within the party do not test ideology or policy, but the ability to marshal patronage sources, align with the leader's current preferences, and avoid the perception of overreaching. The seventh thing is the conclusion, the fate of Kadaga and the lesson for Uganda. Kadaga's defeat to Anita Among was not simply a matter of delegate conference or preference. It was the enactment of a political philosophy that within Uganda's ruling party, survival depends less on past service and more on present pliancy. Kadaga became a victim of the very system she had helped entrench, experiencing what countless others had endured: manipulated processes, bribed delegates, presidential duplicity. Among, by contrast, rose precisely because she represented non-threatening loyalty, a minimum words, avoidance of philosophical claims, and a quiet difference to Museveni made her the more convenient choice. For Uganda, the episode demonstrates that the NRM's internal democracy is less about representation and more about ritualized reformation of Museveni's supremacy. For women's empowerment, it raises the sobering reminder that the presence of women in high office does not guarantee genuine gender liberation if such presence remains contingent on patriarchal patronage. In the end, Kadaga's complaints about bribery, conflicts of interest, and betrayal were not wrong, but they were belated recognition of structure features long baked into the party. She stood against the tide of system designed to humble its own veterans. The lesson is both tragic and instructive. In a patronage order, even founders must bow, and even champions of rights must yield. For loyalty to the supreme leader eclipses all the virtues. Wow, 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 wow. Guys, I'm very sorry. I've never laughed like this online before. Nice time. I hope you're subscribed.